Hi, I'm Alexandra Kitka, and this is Ergo. Religious liberty might be supposed to mean that everybody is free to discuss religion. In practice, it means that hardly anybody is allowed to mention it. G.K. Chesterton. Today we are discussing belief. What role does belief or religion play in shaping an individual? And how do belief systems develop? And how do they develop you? I am joined by Harper Clees-Baron. Harper goes to school with me. He's a fellow student in New York City, and he is an atheist, whereas I am a Christian. Hello, Harper. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Harper, before we start talking about this, I'd just like to ask, when did you become an atheist or just discover that you were an atheist?
That's a really interesting question. So, when I grew up in Maine, and when I lived in Maine, I went to a Catholic kindergarten. And while I was there, I imagined God as he was described to me, which was like a man with a big bushy beard sitting up in a chair full of clouds, like a very like kindergartner's understanding of faith. And that was kind of at odds with my family. My grandfather's like a really, I don't want to say militant, but definitely like staunch atheist. And so I was always kind of unsure of where my belief lied until I moved out of Maine, moved to New York, and went to like a slightly more secular school where I kind of didn't have that more Catholic influence, and it's kind of developed my belief or my lack of belief, my atheism.
So it's interesting to me how you described how you were introduced to the idea of God, because you were introduced by people who probably call themselves Christians, Catholics.
Right.
And I'm someone who grew up in a Christian home, but the way that you describe how you were introduced into God is very, very different of an experience from the way that I was introduced to God.
Right.
Do you think that maybe that had an effect on your belief?
It's hard to say. I think that the way that I viewed God after I left that Catholic school was like a farce. Like I was like, this is really, really absurd to me. And I think it's possible that because God was described to me in such like fanciful terms that's how I arrived at that conclusion. But I had by that time been exposed to other ways of viewing God or like conceptualizing what God means. So I think it may have had a small effect, but it wasn't the deciding factor.
So your parents, I didn't catch this. Are they religious?
My parents are both kind of, I'd say, more agnostic than anything else, but they wouldn't describe themselves as really serious atheists in the same way that my grandparents would. And I think I agree with them to an extent. I think anybody who says they know for sure is not basing anything, like not speaking from a place of knowing. So I think the idea of being agnostic, it makes a lot more sense to me, but people kind of confuse agnostic for atheist, and in order to simplify it, I kind of just call myself an atheist.
Yeah, actually, what you're saying kind of reminds me of one of the physics teachers at our school, Mr. Reynolds. One time I was having a conversation with him about religion, and I don't exactly remember how I asked it, but I asked him if he was an atheist, and he said no, he was an agnostic. And his reasoning that he gave was you can't prove the non-existence of something.
Exactly.
But then I've definitely talked to other people who said, well, as an atheist, I'm not saying I definitely know that God doesn't exist, but I'm saying that I don't have belief in God.
Right. And so that's kind of this gray area between atheist and agnostic that I think I fall into.
So let me just briefly, I guess, go into my faith experience. My faith background sounds basically the inverse of yours. I was in the New York City public school systems for most of my life, and I was usually the odd one out. Not necessarily to say that I was the only person there who believed in God. That certainly wasn't true. But I do remember, because my dad is a pastor, and my parents planted a church in New York City, I was kind of always having to explain why I believed a certain thing, or what foundation I had to build up my beliefs. So I'm just kind of curious, because I think that in previous conversations we've had, you have said that your outlook as an atheist has kind of changed a little bit over time. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. So, in middle school, as I solidified my atheism, I became really judgmental of like people. Okay, I called them theists because it was like I was an atheist, so I just assumed. So that meant to me like anyone who believed in anything other than being an atheist. I was really judgmental of people because for kind of the reasons that I think that a lot of atheists are judgmental, which is like there's so many facts that like I thought like refuted religion, and so anybody who was religious was like dumb for not like seeing that. And so I spent a lot of time on like Instagram arguments.
We've all been there.
Yeah. Not the best use of your time. And I think I was really close-minded. As I then left middle school, I kind of met more people who were like intellectually my equal or superior and like were religious, and I realized like, oh, religious people aren't like dumb, they just see the world a little differently. So I feel like I developed a sense of respect for that, which has made my life a lot more interesting. Like, it's amazing, and this sounds a little cliche, but it's amazing like how much you can understand when you allow yourself to. So yeah, that's
Yeah, the first real quote unquote atheist that I ever met was actually a really close friend of mine. His name was George. And he would always want to get into debates about atheism and about religion. So I guess my experience with atheists when I was growing up, and this was probably in middle school or late elementary school, was very similar to probably who you were at that time.
yeah.
So I think there's kind of in society this, I guess, personality or stereotype that we place upon people who identify as atheists. Do you think that that's accurate at all?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the stereotypes that like the thing about stereotypes, it's the whole grain of truth idea. Like a lot of atheists tend to be really snobby because they act like they know something that other people don't. And I think the same is true about any religion. Like you can be really anybody who thinks that they have figured it out and that everyone else hasn't figured it out is going to be kind of snobby until they are exposed to other ideas and see the legitimacy of them. So I think the stereotypes about atheists definitely hold some water. But I think the stereotypes around like a lot of other beliefs are like have a grain of truth as well. And then there are tons of refutations of that. So it's hard because when you're speaking in generalizations, there's always going to be exceptions. But I think that actually in this case, like there are more not snobby and annoying atheists than there are snobby and annoying atheists. Just as there are more like just like nice Christians as there are like mean like persecuting Christians, which is the stereotype that atheists kind of push on to Christians.
I think a big reason why we have placed this stereotype on atheists and why atheists, especially people who have converted, who have made a unconscious decision at some time during their life, they're really a lot of times the minority. And I think that when you have a belief that is the minority, in a sense, you have to be kind of cocky about it. As I said, I kind of had the inverse situation, and I did not grow up with people who had the same beliefs all around me. So I think, in a sense, if I was an atheist and you took my atheist self and put it next to who I was during middle school or during that time, I probably attributed you could probably attribute a lot of the same characteristics to me. I loved talking about religion. I loved arguing about it. So do you think that there's also something to be said for the people around you and the religious beliefs of the majority?
I think there I think that there's a lot to be said for the people who are willing to discuss it. Like whenever there's a difference in opinion, I think people either have the reaction where they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to like start any arguments. They kind of want to just like ignore it, or there are people who are really willing to like talk about it, and they're either going to judge you for it or they're trying to kind of be more open-minded. And I think that that's um, a really really big part of a lot of like I don't want to. Is believers a good term? Do you
Sure.
like okay?
That works.
Yeah. I think that like I liked to tell myself that Christians or like what I called theists like didn't want to talk about religion. I knew one girl who like didn't like to talk about it, which is fine also. Like people don't have to defend their beliefs to you all the time. But I think that as I like met more people who were more willing to discuss their ideas with me, I like felt as though I'm digging myself in a hole for a second.
Take a breath.
Yeah.
You can repeat your sentence.
All right. Could you rephrase your question? I'm sorry. Or not rephrase, restate. So I think that the religious views of people around me definitely did shape my atheism, but not positively. Like, so after I left the Catholic school, I ended up in I described it previously as a more secular school, which is true, but that what bothered me was that it was still very spiritual, and I felt like they wouldn't admit that it was spiritual. They kind of were just they'd like have us sing like really really religious like grace songs before we ate, but then when I said like I wasn't really comfortable singing that, they were like, well then you can just sit outside and eat. And I was like, I shouldn't be ostracized for having to sit outside. So I think that the religious views of the people around me as my atheism developed actually made me less open-minded because people were so like not welcoming. They're really like very like rude about me not wanting to participate in like various like spiritual traditions.
What do you mean by spiritual?
I'm glad you asked that. I think I'm using it to mean a very specific thing. So after I left that Catholic school, the school that I started at was definitely more secular, but that is not to say that it was a secular school. It was founded by, or it was based on principles developed by the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner. So it had a lot of like kind of I don't know wacky elements. So like there was a lot of watercolor and something that they called eurythmy, which is like they call it basically means like body poetry, and it was a class that we had to take, and it was very strange. And another element that they thought was really important was spirituality, in a kind of like non-denominational way. Like it wasn't like specific to any one religion. It was just like kind of this idea of like having faith in a higher power. And like the idea that you need to be like reverent to something, which I really rejected because almost more so than I rejected or way more than I rejected the philosophies of the Catholic school, because it felt so like intangible to me. It was like I have to be reverent to this person who I don't even know who it's supposed to be. So when I use the word spirituality, I think I mean this kind of very like vague sense of like religion, but not like a specific belief, like not like Christianity or Judaism, just kind of this more like loose definition.
Now, I think what you're saying is very interesting because in this way we're very similar. I think that my mind is naturally inclined to not consider quote unquote spiritual things. I'm very scientific. I'm very this is the way that it is.
Right.
And which is funny because I'm not an atheist. So this kind of brings me to this idea of both of us value science.
Yes.
You love physics. I think you're doing an internship right now, right?
Yeah.
And you're doing like astrophysics.
Yes. It's really interesting. I don't want to say it's my calling because that's such a cliche, and I hate people who say that they found their calling, but it's definitely like what I would like to be doing. So yeah.
Yeah. So we both kind of are very academic in the way we approach life. But you're an atheist and I'm a theist. So do you think that we can say that our belief systems or lack thereof really have an effect at all if we kind of both approach it from the same way?
I think they do have an effect, and I think that you are an exception because I think that a lot of times Christians will place Christianity in direct conflict with science. And that might be speaking from stereotypes and you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong because it's really likely that I could be. But from what I've seen, what I've read on the news, like the Creationist Museum and stuff like that, and of course this is like a really extreme example, but I think that oftentimes I think the church places science in contempt of the church.
I've heard that quite often, but the funny thing is that has been the opposite of my experience as someone growing up in the church. Perhaps it's because of where we live in New York City, but I didn't even know that people were considered that there was a discrepancy between science and religion until quite recently. And most of the Christians I know love studying. They love English and science and mathematics. And I know brilliant professors and academics who are Christian and who hold to those ideals.
Mm-hmm.
I think that probably what you are saying does bring into the idea of religion and of religion shaping our perspective. But I do think it's very interesting that me and you both kind of are this way. We're very, very academic. Where do you think that love of knowledge or love of intellectualism stems from?
I think that there's something inherent in our humanity about wanting to know. When somebody asks you a question, you want to know the answer. Like people naturally have questions, and people have been asking these big questions that science promises to answer for a really long time. I think my interest in academics stems from these big questions, and my view that academics is probably the most likely way to answer them. And that actually brings me to a question for you. Academics to me seems like the most promising way to answer these like big questions, like why are we here? Where did we come from? To me, it seems like religion, it's also provides alternate answers to that question. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how you reconcile the two as a fiercely religious but also fiercely academic person.
I think that's a really good question, and it's something that I love talking about. Just from growing up and the way that I grew up, a little backstory, both of my parents grew up in homes that are very different from the home that I grew up in. They were not religious, and they found their faith later in their lives. And both of my parents went to college. They're both very, very academic people who love reading and love exploring things from all different perspectives. And so I think because of that, and because of just who I am as a person, I've always treated academics and my faith on kind of a similar level. I don't see them contradicting each other. I see them as being supplementary. I look at the world of science, for example, and see that we have this simultaneous evolution. We're trying to survive. The world is working in a way that makes us survive. But at the same time, there's this idea of entropy and this idea that we're heading towards ultimate chaos. And I've always seen that as a reflection of the fall and of mankind going away from God. And so I think that to answer your question, I don't choose one or the other. I look at them both together, and if I see a discrepancy, I don't assume one over the other. I just work harder to make sure that both of my perspectives are correct. Because ultimately, I think that if you have this worldview of faith and you truly believe it, it should make sense with what the world is reflecting. It should not contradict science, or you have a very serious problem.
But there are some things about religion that, from my perspective at least, are, one, inherent to religion, and two, are directly contradicted by science. And I feel like it's easy to say that you kind of have both, but sometimes it feels like they're so contradictory that it doesn't seem possible to hold both in your head. So
would you like to point to an specific example?
Exactly. Yeah, I would. So I think a really good example. What's hard is coming up with an example because I don't know your exact beliefs, but I think a good example would be like when we think the Earth was created. So like there is direct evidence that the Earth, like scientific evidence that the Earth was formed around 4.5 billion years ago, and yet there's also a lot of different religions that claim that the Earth was created at different times, but much more recently. So I'm curious, like, those are two things that cannot be reconciled.
I think that this is actually a perfect example of what I was saying. I see science and religion, or at least my religion, on the same level. And so when I see something like young Earth creationism, for example, which is the idea that you posed, I see that is contradicting what I know about science. But from there, I don't say, well, science has to be correct. And I don't go in the other direction and say, well, these creationists have to be correct because they're using the Bible. The fact is that there are people who interpret the Bible very differently. And so what this means to me is that I have to work harder to look at the original Hebrew to see what it actually means, and to then go look at science and maybe I won't be a scientist myself, but at least participate in the scientific realm to make sure that really these don't contradict, because ultimately I believe that they won't.
We talked a lot about like reconciling religion and science. I'm wondering also how you reconcile like the morality set out in religion versus like I think like slightly contradictory morality or like moral ideas that are true like in kind of a more modern time. So like as a gay person, one of the things that drove me away from religion was the idea that was always expressed to me was that religious people don't like gay people. And so I was like, oh, well then why would I want to be religious? So I'm curious, like, how do you reconcile those two things as well?
So I think I can also talk about the broader realm of ethics, but first I want to address specifically what you said. Harper, we know each other outside of school, and I hope you think that I appreciate you as a person, and I care for you and love you.
Of course.
You know? So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
You know, I've always learned, and I should correct something that I said earlier. I actually did go to a Christian school for 2 years of my life in middle school. And those were really foundational in really who I am as a person now. And when I was at that school, just the things that were communicated to me were it doesn't matter who a person is. God made them, and you are supposed to love them. It is your duty. There's in Greek there are a lot of different words for love. Mm-hmm. In English, we say love when we're referring to ice cream or our mother, and I hope you don't like ice cream in the same way that you love your mother.
Right.
But there's this one particular word that's agape, and agape means unconditional sacrificial love. Mm. And this is really the overwhelming big theme of my religion and of the Bible. And so for me, I think, to answer your question without getting into the semantics behind it, because this is a pretty short podcast and that can
Right.
be another conversation. I think that the thing that I was always taught is love everyone first, and then we can get into all those other things. So I want to talk about ethics because you brought up this idea, and as someone who is atheist, where do your ethics come from? Where do you get your morality?
Right. And this is a question that, like, I was talking about how you reconcile religion with science. And, like, this is, like, a question that I think atheists get just as commonly. It's the classic question. I feel as though we all have some sense of what's right and wrong by that we learn from observing the world around us. For example, in most religions, you can't just steal things. You can't steal things, right? And all of these religions have like different doctrines and came up around from like in different places in the world and didn't necessarily come in contact with one another, and yet they all have some overlap in their like ethical policies. And I think that's because we as humans know what's right and wrong without having to have religion guide us. And that's shown by the fact that all of these different religions have the same ethics to an extent.
So I agree with basically your whole response there. But my I guess what I'm asking is where does that come from? If you think about just evolution, evolution is not based on humanity in general surviving. It's about specific populations who may be in different places. And so that's why we have variation in our hair color, in our skin. So why is that foundation of ethics the same? Because when I look at it, of course, as I said, I don't think that science and religion contradict. So when I look at it, I see that as a reflection of the image of God in humanity. How do you
Oh, that's really
that?
interesting. Okay. So something that I heard actually on a TED Talk recently was that people often think evolution is about the survival of yourself, and the survival of like the one fittest person, and then they live to recreate or procreate and like have more like fitter people. I think, but really it's about the survival of the group that you are a part of, because genes are often like in small groups kind of get mixed around a lot. So for example, your brother or your sister will have the exact same genetic code as you, but your cousin will have half of the same like genetic code as you. So it's not just about the survival of yourself, it's about the survival of you and the people around you. And we know that societies work better when people follow these like basic ethical rules, like don't steal, don't kill people, stuff like that.
I think that can work for a lot of ethics. I think that what you're referring to is altruism, and the idea that it's probably better for our community to survive if I don't kill you, if I don't steal what you've made for yourself to eat. But you know, something that just comes to mind as something that is not necessarily explained by altruism within a population is love your enemy. Where would that come in? Evolution, as you said, is not about the individual, but it is about the population. So what about across populations?
I think it really depends on how you define enemy, because your enemy does not have to be another population. Your enemy can be within your own population as well. So in that sense, I think that does kind of support this like altruistic idea, like loving your enemy can just be your neighbor. So and that does support this altruistic idea. However, I also think that loving your enemy appeals to people's egos because you have this sense of like I'm being better than you because I'm loving you while you don't like me. So it's a way for people to almost, I don't want to say like feel superior to others, but it's a way to like, yeah, it's a way to feel superior to others, I think, in a very and this is a very cynical way of looking at it, but when you love your neighbor who hates you, you know somewhere deep down that you're like a little better than them because you are able to love them while they can only hate you. So I think that humans are ultimately pretty ego driven. So I think it appeals to that as well.
So I'm going to shift the conversation away from ethics right now, just because we have other things to talk about.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, this is just probably just a question for you. Do you consider atheism a belief system?
The knee-jerk like atheist response is that it's not a belief system. Like, it's a lack of a belief system. I think you have to be a little more nuanced than that because it is definitely like a worldview.
When I think of a religion, I think there are different ways of thinking about it. You can think in terms of the law, and of course, in terms of the law, atheism kind of has to be considered a religion or a belief because what your beliefs are protected in the Bill of Rights. But what we're talking about is not so much as a legal system,
Right.
but in terms of culture. And I've often heard this idea that, well, a lack of belief is not a belief. And I think that statement is true if you have that statement alone. But I think that in the practical world, a lack of a belief can lend itself to a lot of other beliefs. If I say I don't think World War II happened, that's a lack of a belief on a technical sense. But it brings with it all of these other things that you may not be expecting just from that statement alone. I think that as someone who is not an atheist, I'm willing to say that atheism itself is not a belief, but humanism, existentialism, all these other philosophies that kind of go into atheism quite often end up pretty much looking like a belief once you carry them out.
I don't think that there is such thing as a lack of a belief. You don't believe in World War II. Sure, you could say that's a lack of a belief, but it's also a belief that World War II didn't happen. So I think that, and that's one of the reasons that it gets kind of difficult because, like, how can you call something a lack of a belief? Because it's a belief that it's not true, and you cannot prove atheism. So it's not like something that is known. It's something that is believed. I think, though, the distinction is that atheism, or like, okay, I think oftentimes people talk about science as like the religion of atheism, and view it as equal to Christianity and Judaism and Islam and all these other religions. And while I don't think it's like unequal or somehow better, I do think that there's a definite difference between atheism and other religions, in that it's based exclusively on observations. Nobody observed God, therefore it's likely that there is no God. And science is based mostly on observations. It's a lot harder to refute, to like flat out say like, I don't believe in science. But it's really hard to not believe in science because it's based on observations.
Yeah.
And it's based on observations that everyone can see.
I, of course, would challenge the idea that science is the religion of atheism, but I don't think we really have time for that particular discussion. So I guess what we're kind of both agreeing on is that maybe atheism in itself is not what you would call organized religion. You know, you don't go to actually...
Well, the thing is that culturally, atheism is like a religion,
Yes.
in that like it's a belief, it's an idea that everyone has. People talk about it. It has a place. It as like a culture, as a cultural. I don't want to say thing, but thing.
Yeah, worldview is a good word, and you used that before. I think I mostly agree with what you said about schools, that science should not be considered the religion of atheism when we're talking about schools. I mean, but even if you just think about that in a pragmatic way, there are so many religions, and there's so much diversity within religions. It would be impossible to just put religion in school.
Right.
But we are digressing. One last question. Do you think that there's still a place for religion in a secular world?
This is a question that I think I would have had a very different answer to a couple years ago. I remember seeing pictures on Instagram, because I followed all these like really like weird atheist Instagram accounts, and seeing pictures like with like the Twin Towers being like, imagine a world without religion. And it was like, it was saying that like if we didn't have religion, nobody would have had any motivation to like fly planes into the Twin Towers. But I don't agree with that. I think religion is used as an excuse for humans' like inherent tribalism. So I don't like subscribe to that argument that like the world would be this better place without religion. If you can believe it, I think it does a lot of good for the people who do subscribe to like religious ideals. I like right now, I don't think I would be able to, but for those who are able to, it can inspire people to do a lot of good. It can inspire people inwardly and outwardly. And this idea of like loving everyone is the most important thing, I definitely agree with. So I do think that religion has an important place in a secular world. But I also think that if left unwatched, it can like overgrow its area and start encroaching on other things. Because religion is often like a pastor in a church, it's often this like idea of like, you have to listen to me. It's like one person saying to a group of people, you have to listen to me because I have this like ultimate authority. And I think that that's just inherently dangerous no matter where you see it, whether that's in religion or in another context. So, sorry, this is quite a long answer. But to answer your question, it has a place. I think it does a lot of good, but it also has the potential to do a lot of bad. So we have to monitor that.
I think that with any belief system or lack thereof, with anything that you give to humans can be used as a tool for good or as a weapon of evil. And I guess just to wrap this up a little bit, I would just like to quote the great esteemed Albert Einstein. Just because I think we talked a lot in this podcast about the relationship between religion and science, and Einstein had a very unique perspective on this. He was very what you would call spiritual. So to end, Albert Einstein, the most beautiful and most profound experience is the sensation of the mystical. It is the sower of all true science. Well, I want to thank Harper for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
I'd also like to thank the executive producer, Quinn Accardi, for the production of this video. Remember, you can always visit my website at alexandrakytka.com. That's ALEXANDRAKYTKA.com. Thank you.